Welcome to Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Dr. Michael Alsey. He's a clinical psychologist in private practice in Tarrytown, New York, a mental health educator at Manhattan School of Music, my wife's alma mater, and author of the book, Therapeutic Improvisation, How to Stop Winging It and Own It as a Therapist. Michael Sherlock is a sales and leadership communications strategist and CEO of Shock Your Potential, a global professional development training company. And Peter Winnick works with individuals and organizations to build and grow revenue streams through their thought leadership platforms and is host of the Leveraging Thought Leadership podcast. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you for having us.
And here is the scenario we will be discussing. With only a few notable exceptions, the entire world has condemned the atrocities of October 7th perpetrated by Hamas terrorists on Israeli civilians. Citizens of Gaza, however, remain loyal to Hamas leaders, and those same acts of violence seem widely endorsed and even celebrated. Particularly disturbing is how Palestinian youth are indoctrinated into Jew hatred. Early childhood television programming depicts Israelis as evil oppressors who deserve violent death, while camp activities and games include play-acting attacks on Jews and paramilitary-style exercises against Israelis. If Palestinians are genuinely victims of brainwashing, how can they be held accountable for their actions and attitudes? If an entire society is convinced of the justice of destroying another people, what steps are possible toward achieving peace? And if peace is unachievable, what options does that other people have to defend itself? Furthermore, it is not only Palestinians that have celebrated or approved terrorist acts by Hamas on college campuses across the country, most notably Harvard University. Anti-Israel rhetoric has raised alarms of resurgent anti-Semitism. But are these students not also victims of ideological indoctrination by their professors? Is there a difference between indoctrination and brainwashing? Many conservatives claim that university is no longer a marketplace of ideas, but a petri dish for the cultivation of groupthink. Does their claim have merit? If so, how do we as a society restore balance to the free exchange of ideas? And what I think I should do as a rabbi is acknowledge that I am not entirely unbiased in this conversation. Although I always do my best to try to fairly represent both sides of the issue. So the floor is open. Any initial thoughts?
Oh, boy.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Start it.
I mean, my first thought is there's a difference between brainwashing, ideological indoctrination, and personal responsibility. So if you look at that on a continuum, a 3-year-old or 10-year-old, whatever, Palestinian that's been exposed to children's cartoons and all these things from the time they're this big gets to a place by 10 or 12 that is more beyond their control than a Harvard undergrad at 20 drawing their own conclusions that's clearly theoretically at the top, 1/10 of 1% of the IQ continuum. So I don't think you can put those two things in the same category as it relates to what's the level of personal responsibility. You see these god-awful videos of an 8-year-old holding a gun. Well, I doubt there's a lot of agency or personal choice there. So that's my initial reaction to what is an awful situation.
Yeah, and I have an idea on that too, in terms of the distinctions between, as a psychologist, right, we'd say one aspect of indoctrination, or on a lower level, is groupthink, right? Yeah. Groupthink is the idea that we want to conform, we want to believe what everybody in the group thinks that we shares is right. And it's the capacity to not look at other viewpoints, even within our own supposedly, sometimes even homogenous group. So I think groupthink is something of a symptom in the culture. And then I think, Peter, I agree with you that indoctrination and brainwashing bring it along that continuum. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about groupthink is it's the capacity not to be unsettled by other divergent opinions. It's the lack of actively seeking out diversity, multiplicity of truths, complication, and the word that I'd use is nuance. I think, we live in a polarizing culture where we get intrigued and almost internet trolled into being, having the all and be all and end all truth. And perhaps we feel so self-sufficiently capable of doing that we forget that, as Rabbi, you talk about, it's grappling with the truths and grappling with the shades of gray. And so I think, one of the things about anything in terms of indoctrination or brainwashing on any side, right? Whether we're talking about Palestinian, Israeli, Ukraine, Russia, any area, any particular conflict, is do you actively try to have empathic understanding of another side or sides? And can you also represent your side with the same kind of nuance?
I think that's well said. And, the Stephen L. Carter, the Yale law professor, he says in his book on integrity that the word integrity comes from the word integer. And an integer is a whole number. And until we've done our due diligence, which means making our best, sincere, determined effort to see all possible sides, we can't be confident in our position because it's limited to one perspective, which is not representative of whole truth. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah,
Well,
it's
it's
interesting.
Michael, other Michael.
Other Michael. Oh, of course.
Sorry, we've got to. I think it's interesting that we already started with this concept of indoctrination and brainwashing and groupthink, because it was kind of the first place I went to with this topic as well. And I was actually looking up the definitions of both, brainwashing versus indoctrination.
Yep.
And I think that when I was really diving in more to the story of the Harvard students, the first thing I thought of is, why is this sense of groupthink? I hadn't come up with that term, but why is this sense of needing to be a part of a whole to make a broad statement versus having these individuals be able to say, here's how I feel about this, and be able to stand on your own, like you're talking about? What I see is that really muddies the water now is, in our society, we talk about this a lot, that we are so polarized that we are either going to say something and hold to it and then run away, or we're going to not talk at all because of fear of what just happened with these students. So they had a group think discussion, they put out their statement on the issue, and now it's become individuals being targeted one by one for their thoughts, whether or not we agree with that or not. It starts to force us to separate and say, what do you really stand for? Do you really stand for this part of this concept of the entire group, or do you really think on your own? Which in some sense, I think was I'm not saying it's a good outcome to have these people's families threatened and all those other elements just of talking about the Harvard University students, but the fact that it's forcing a dialogue about how many people signed those letters, what are your actual beliefs? Now you have to have those discussions with your family. When siblings are being targeted as well, you actually have to start to say, this is what I believe and why I believe it. And maybe, just maybe, in some of those dialogues, we'll understand that maybe some of those people didn't think those things, but they felt compelled to go along with the group because that's what you do, or those are the people that you hang around with. Maybe that will be an opportunity to widen people's perspectives. I don't know. The flip side is they may all go into their cubby holes and never come out again and change their name so that they're not on the do not hire list. Mm-hmm. So it's the grappling is really good, bad, and ugly, but it does expose us if we're willing to take a stance.
We all know from being young that peer pressure is an enormous force. And the larger the group and the more powerful the group, the more intestinal fortitude it takes to resist and to speak up
Yes,
and you go against.
absolutely. And I think that that's, what even by having people see, like on the Harvard campus, the truck outside with the people's names and their pictures on there, that takes, you better really be behind your opinion if that might be the outcome. But at the flip side, I think we also have to be able to step back and speak really with thought. Like, Michael was saying, are these really your ideals, or are they something that you're just conforming to because of the moment? Can you grapple with both sides of an issue in order to make a statement about what you believe that actually has meaning to you, whether or not we agree with it or not, or anybody else does? If you can really make that, I think that's when you see people that move away from indoctrination or brainwashing into true self-sufficiency and agency, privilege of agency.
Mhm.
Yeah, I actually think another point that you bring up too, Michael, is this dual human need that we have to belong to something bigger than ourselves, whether it's family, cultural group, ethnic group, sports team, political affiliation. This is the need, the social need that we're evolutionarily built with. And that's what's made us thrive. And yet, counterbalancing that is the individual need to sometimes be, as you said, Rabbi, someone who's able to stand up and sometimes even go against. And we have, like, in English class in high school, wasn't it always the individual versus society is always the perpetual struggle? And so I think we want to humanize that it's challenging to figure out how to satisfy both of those things, how to belong to the group that you cherish and value, how do you have your individual opinion, and sometimes, how come sometimes those clash in very unexpected ways, right?
You mentioned English. I often quote my English professor from college. He said, "I don't understand why people complain about being disillusioned." He said, "I would like to be relieved of my illusions."
Yeah.
I want to add on to something that Michael said, and it's that, you need to be part of a group, something bigger than yourself, whatever. I think where that manifests in a really bad way today is the echo chamber effect, right? So it used to be, theoretically, at least when I was a kid, when you watched the news, which was only on at 6 or 7 or 11 at night on ABC, NBC, whatever, theoretically, you got an objective opinion. Now, we could debate whether it was left, right, whatever. It wasn't Fox and CNN, right? It was closer. Now, even where you get your objective information from is largely self-selected, is largely not challenging your beliefs, but reinforcing what you believe to be true, whether it's the earth is round or flat. So you're not getting exposed to things that challenge you, that force you to think, which I think weakens the individuality component of it. If everything sounds like what your twisted beliefs are or untwisted beliefs are, then why bother thinking?
Well, the whole name of this program, Grappling with the Gray, is in between what's obviously black and obviously white. That's where you have tension. That's where you have struggle. That's where you have a lack of clarity by definition. And it's, if I can retreat into the black or into the white so that I don't have to deal with that messiness and that fuzziness and that lack of clarity and the lack of security that comes from it, that can be very attractive from a psychological view. Can't it, Dr. Elsey?
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm working on a book project right now, and I looked up the etymology for nuance because I was curious, like, where we got this word from. And you know where it's from? It's from clouds. In French, it's nuage, right? And so it's cloudy because nuance, there's different shadings in clouds. Now, you could look at that, like you said, as, oh my gosh, it's cloudy, this is bad. But clouds have infinite variety and beauty.
Sure.
And so you're right, the gray has all of this. But the other thing about clouds is that they're dimensional, right? And I think that's sort of what you're getting at, that's important to what we need to approach this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I'm feeling Judy Collins coming on right now, but we'll
yeah.
probably.
Oh no, it's Joni Mitchell, right? Yeah, too.
One of the challenges I face, and I'll be very transparent about this because it's something I've grappled with the last several years, is that because people in my life, I have many people in my life who are very polarized on certain issues, especially with politics, that I have found myself personally and individually in the last 8 years, 10 years maybe, but definitely the last 6, just being quiet a lot. And I've always been one who I like to listen to hear what other people have to say. But when I used to do that a lot, even with subjects and topics that might be a little controversial, because I would listen and then be able to say, you know, when you said that, let me tell you how I see it. But because even especially with people that I really care about, because polarization of ideals has become so ugly, that I find myself being quiet, and I'm disappointed in myself for that, because I believe that I'm the type of person, whether I'm, teaching a sales, technique, or I'm dealing with leadership training, that I'm getting people to listen and converse based on differences of opinion or different modes of conversation. But I myself hide from them at times because I don't want to get into ugliness with people I love. Which makes me wonder why I'm loving some of them.
But I think the other side of listening is speaking, right? So it is almost nostalgic to be able to have a disagreement with someone that you have a totally opposite belief on, in a respectful way that doesn't end with the mudslinging. Like, hey, you could think X and I can think Y. I respect you. I admire you in most other areas, whatever. Let's have a conversation. And then one is, I'm probably not going to change your mind. That's not the intent. But
Right.
how do you come to those beliefs? Maybe that helps me understand the why, the whatever. But then let's move on. And we could still sit down and break bread. And I actually just on this, I just finished reading Dan Ariely's new book, which is called Misbelief: What Makes Rational People Believe Irrational Things. And he talks about all these things, all the psychology of it. He's a behavioral economist and psychologist and whatnot. An otherwise normal, intelligent, whatever, believes these crazy conspiracy theories. And you're like, how they didn't just wake up one day and just decide that, whatever, Bill Gates is controlling the Illuminati and the, COVID vaccines will cause you to do, like, all this craziness. So understanding how misbelief happens and then choosing when to speak. Because now I find not that I pull back from a disagreement, but in order to disagree, two people have to agree the rules of disagreement and about being civil. If it ends in screaming, yelling, and profanities, nothing got accomplished there.
Yeah, and that's a point that, I mean, you're both making a similar point that, we want to engage. We want to give others the opportunity, not necessarily to change their minds, but to let them see that there is a coherent view different from their own. But I also, if I get the sense that this person's just not going to listen, they're not going to be receptive, then what's the point? The goal will not be achieved. So is it worth the effort for me to actually engage them? And it certainly applies online. In the Jewish community, many are saying don't engage these people online when they're holding radical views. And I have a couple of times, because I'm not really interested in changing their minds, but I want, if other people are reading the threads, I want them to see that there is a coherent response, and that the opposing view may not be that solid. Because if you only let one side speak, then people who are standing on the sidelines say, well, that's all there is. I guess there must be something to it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Rabbi, you bring up a really good point too, is that I think, and Peter, you brought this up before as well with the echo chambers. It's almost like interesting that technology liberates us and then it imprisons us, right? So the internet gave us this wonderful way of connecting, World Wide Web, right? It gave us all these tools for doing what we're doing right now and doing all sorts of interesting things, doing remote work. It also gives us the capacity to choose our own news source and to curate our own ideas as if they're the only thing in the world. and we've lost sort of some common ground because of necessity. I can find my people who agree exactly with what I think, and I can find those people who would advocate for me. And sort of like what you said, Peter, when we all had to face some common facts or circumstances that we could have some close enough agreement on, even when we disagreed, we still
Well,
respected
yeah.
each other in the room.
And I think part of that problem is, I'm pre-internet or even 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't just say, I read that somewhere. You'd say, well, actually, the fact that I read, I can attribute to the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, whatever, some respected organization. And I don't think enough people differentiate that attribution that has a standard to, my dopey's cousin's neighbor's comment on a Facebook page. Like those are not fully weighted. And I think, so someone said, well, I read it somewhere, and the where matters and the who matters. Like I have lots of opinions on lots of things, most of which are irrelevant because they're beyond my scope of expertise, or, who really cares what I would think about, I don't know, women's shoe fashion.
And as Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you read on the internet, right?
Exactly. He did say that. Yeah.
There's a note here,
speech,
comment
yeah.
from Hildegard, which follows up on the conversation. Sometimes our silence can be powerful also, especially when you are respectful. In a Socratic way, you might add to the birth of new ideas, insights, or just some healing and calm. There is a teaching, one of the classic teachings of the sages, where one of the great leaders of his generation, he said, I grew up among the sages, and I never found anything better for a person than silence.
Mm-hmm.
Because if everybody's talking, nobody's listening. We're just talking to ourselves. And then you get into this tribalization, you get into the groupthink. We're all convinced we're right because we've never given ourselves the opportunity. If I stay silent and let you speak, especially if I can then restate to you what you said so that you can see that you've been heard, then I have a much better chance that you might listen to me.
And that's the same thing in couples counseling as well.
Sure.
That really, we all want to be right in the couple, and we all need to entertain being wrong, and actually allow a space, because we'll still get our turn. I think that's the other thing. I think there's a fear that we're not going to get our turn, that we're going to get it aired. So speaking of, Michael, you were about to say something when I took your turn.
Well, actually, and as you were talking, you reminded me of a different story that may or may not have impact here. But I think about, the conscious kind of, we're talking about like a little bit of the conscious decision to dumb yourself down by only surrounding yourself with your own ideas. And so then you build that and it becomes a little bit of a shelter in a story. Mm-hmm. So as you started talking about, couples therapy, Rabbi, I was thinking about a little more than a year ago, I went to a wedding in New Jersey. And it was with the bride was Christian and the groom was Jewish. So he had a rabbi and a pastor. And the rabbi, by the way, not comparing but the rabbi just like blew everything out of the water. It was so amazing. But he talked about this story about a shelf and the advice he gives to couples when they come. And he said, if you imagine that as a couple, you have a shelf in your house, and that shelf is every day you put things on there that are of love and, how much I love you and you're wonderful, but you're also putting things up there on that shelf. Like, I can't believe you left your underwear on the floor again. I can't believe, that you want to talk to your mother all the time. And, and I want to, spend time with you. But he was talking about the grievances that build up in relationships. And, if you really want to have a long, healthy relationship, you clear that shelf off every night and you say, I'd just like to tell you that I was frustrated that you left your underwear on the floor again today. I'd really like us to work better to have a clean house, and put the clothes in the hamper. And if you can do that, and you can do it every day, you don't have the buildup. And I think that where we are as a global society, as we continue to, create our own foxholes of, people and ideas around us, we have a shelf that is, 10 miles deep of only things that we've told ourselves, but we've never cleared them to say, is this really right? Is this really wrong? Can I have a discussion? it builds even further into this almost a choice of self-indoctrination or a choice of self-brainwashing to say, I'm only going to believe this because my shelf is so full of my examples of this that I don't ever want to even look at another idea that you might have. And, you know, where we are today, I don't know how we break this. I mean, I'm really like, I feel so helpless in a way of how are we going to break this cycle of where we are to start having human to human interactions again with people that do have other ideas.
Obviously, the answer is to get hundreds of thousands and millions of people to watch this podcast.
Absolutely.
So that should be on our agenda. But you know what, you've got me thinking, and it's something I've thought about over time, that really what you're saying is we become so invested in the ideas that we've held. The longer we hold them, the more emotionally attached we become to them, and the more painful it becomes to contemplate that maybe they're not worth holding on to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I use this
Well,
example all the time because I've done it, that you're in the middle of an argument and it suddenly dawns on you that you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the thing to do is say, oh, you know what? I realize you got a point. But what do we often do is we double down. We start arguing harder. Well, I don't want to look foolish because I've been defending this point for 10 minutes now.
right.
And I'll look like an idiot if I suddenly say, oh, gee, I was wrong. But
Well,
what we do is-
I think what happens is in politics, one of the worst things you could call your opponent is a flip-flopper.
right.
And very
Mm.
few handle that with grace to say, yes, you know, I used to believe X, but then I learned additional information or the whatever. Here's some variables, or here's why I thought X at a moment in time. Here's some new information I got, and I had the courage to change my beliefs based on new information. Because if you don't change your thinking based on continually getting new inputs, then you're an idiot, right? Like it's just,
as long as it doesn't happen every week, then you're, you're okay.
well, yeah. But at some
But
point,
yeah,
you
you're absolutely right.
used to firmly believe that, you know, whatever, you know, eating eggs is horrible for cholesterol. And then, you know, 3 weeks later, that comes out with, no, well, you can have eggs. And then, you know, okay, well, why did you believe that at time? You weren't silly to believe it. That's where the facts were. And now there's better facts or new facts or updated facts, not alternative facts, right? You know, and now you change your beliefs, you know, around an issue.
I think there's also the question, Rabbi, that you're bringing up of a certain kind of intellectual and emotional humility, which is a rare commodity these days. I think one of the things that I was hearing a therapist talk about a book he wrote, and you know, he's a master clinician. It's like probably his 10th book. And he was joking. He said, you know what I tell people my job is? My job is to make mistakes and then to fix them with people, right? That's what therapy really is, at its most beautiful place. But it's also about, you know, seeing the lights through the cracks, as Leonard Cohen would say, right? But it's really embracing that there's going to be something beautiful and interesting and important that's going to come. And it takes both strength and humility to do it, which again comes back to that nuance of being able to hold those things. And Peter, I think that's sort of what you're getting at, Rabbi. I think that's what you're getting at, that it's important to cultivate a space of that and to make it more of a central value. And I think in a way, there's a few things that I think are contributing to this, Rabbi. Maybe you tell me if I'm going in another direction, but I think a part of it is all of us can be guilty of some unhealthy narcissism, right? Because we have so much at our narcissistic availability to make us more godlike than we've ever been, which isn't always so good, not always counterbalanced by, you know, make sure, you know, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve someone, as Dylan says, right? So you also should be careful about knowing how to serve someone. The other thing too is I think a lot of these polarizing issues, as a psychologist, I always think most polarizing issues happen from a place of individual trauma or collective trauma. And those are radioactive places. They're not only difficult to talk about, they're impossible, unthinkable to talk about. And what do we do instead? We act them out together. But if you have a good therapist, if you have someone who is able to be receptive, as Michael is saying, and Peter's saying, Rabbi's saying, if you have someone who's able to allow themselves to be moved, but not be taken over, right? We want to be moved, but we also want to be able to hold ourselves. That is an art. And that is an art that we sometimes are losing with the instant gratification of, no, I just want to be comfortable, or I just want to be right. And so I think having some compassion and real compassion, real empathy, and again, real empathy is not endorsing somebody's opinion. I think Rabbi taught me this too, actually. It's not just endorsing someone's opinion, it's being able to be in their skin, to walk in their shoes, and to appreciate why they feel and think the way they do, and how you can get closer to each other.
That really comes back to a point that we haven't investigated yet, and I'm not sure how much time we have to do it, but I can understand. I mean, my heart goes out to these Palestinian children. One, to be living under a regime that I don't believe has their best interests at heart. Two, to be subject to this indoctrination, which may cross the line into brainwashing. But now there's the question of culpability. I mean, you really can't, insanity is a defense, but it isn't license to go act out whatever my insanity prods me to do. I don't go to a prison, but I do go to a place where I won't hurt others or myself. So, when it comes down to a national level, I guess I should say when it rises up to a national level, this gets really messy. You can't really blame the people because they were kids. You can't blame the kids, but you can't hold the leaders responsible because they're hiding in a different country. It really creates a kind of intractable situation.
That brings up a good question of complexity too, actually, Rabbi, because in a way, the complexity of the situation gets lost, right? When you see, oh, wait, there's more shadings to the Palestinian situation or the Israeli situation, just as I think there's more complexity to the history that gets easily sometimes put into a particular narrative or particular narrative tropes, right? But to go back to your point, one of the things Michael, again, I was quick on the buzzer on that one, but the other point that you made that I think is really interesting too is that even if, let's say, it is terrible for the Palestinian children and Palestinian civilians and that those who are suffering, at the same point, well, the other question is, what do you become when you use certain means to an end, right? On any side. And I think Israelis are trying to grapple with that too. Who are you becoming if you take certain actions? And these are difficult questions to ask and difficult questions to answer, but they're essential to face.
Well, and I think one other element of that is, oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
Go ahead, Mark.
The other thing I keep thinking of is how we also keep putting large groups of people into buckets. So, I was raised in the Cold War. So in the Cold War, we were raised to believe the Russians are bad. They're going to kill you. You're going to, hide under your desk and we're going to have these drills. Then as I got older, I thought, well, that may not be really the case. And look at how we're evolving. When Russia, and I say Russia purposely like this for a moment, for a reason that I'll explain, but when Russia invaded Ukraine, all those feelings that I had from being a third grader hiding under my desk came back, and it's big bad Russia, but it's not. It's one horrible person who is also indoctrinating, forcing, brainwashing, all those different elements. That doesn't mean it's the whole Russian people, and it doesn't mean it's the whole Palestinian, culture. But that's where we go to, are these sense of, well, you are this, so that's a bucket. Then therefore I have to paint everybody with that same brush. And I know that logically we don't really believe that inside, but in times of terrible crisis, horrible situations, that becomes the default. So, same thing with, I don't know, I guess I struggle with it so much because to make changes, we have to be able to look at individuals more closely. And yet at the same time, we can't deal with world issues on a one-by-one basis. We have to deal with them in these larger buckets. But it creates another dynamic that I think that if you do have the ability to self-reflect and the humility you were talking about, Michael, you will say, wait a minute, this doesn't paint everybody with the same paintbrush, but I don't know what to do about it. So all I can do is, sit here and watch the horror happen.
You remind me that in Israel, there has long been a tremendous tension between the religious and the secular. And you see it flare up. It was largely underlining this recent debate about the justice reform, which was really mismanaged on both sides. But there were groups that were working to bring religious Jews and secular Jews together in a purely social situation. We're not going to talk about our beliefs. We're not going to talk about our philosophies. We're not going to talk politics. We're going to talk about our families. We're going to talk about our jobs. We're just going to have coffee. And it was a very successful project. And one of the things that's been so remarkable, as someone who lived in Israel for 9 years, is the way in which all of the problems, all of the fights, all the disagreements virtually evaporated overnight on October 7th. I mean, what's going on in Israel is extraordinary. You have non-kosher restaurants that have called in rabbis to make their kitchens kosher so that they can supply food to the religious soldiers. You find people, buying, this guy JFK bought 250 tickets to get reserve soldiers to Israel faster. You've got whole planes flying with supplies that are being donated. It's hard to even talk about a silver lining of these kinds of atrocities, and yet the way that crisis brings people together, if we could just figure out how to do it without the crisis. But that same type of program between the religious and the secular was also implemented between Israelis and Arabs, or I think it was Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, to try to ease some of those tensions. But when it comes to there's a literal and there is an ideological wall separating Gaza from Israel. And it's hard to imagine how to make that same type of project work effectively in that type of situation. Any final thoughts?
It's funny because before Michael said, we're all in our own foxholes. And I think, Rabbi, you bring to life that expression, there are no atheists in foxholes.
Right.
And so when we're actually confronting mortality and existential meaning or meaninglessness, it reminds us to believe in something bigger, and we work together. And I think you're correct. We have to keep that more in the forefront of our mind, not as a supplementary thing that should only happen in crisis. And I think you're right. I think we should think about complicating our views for the sake of trying to help each of us make meaning, as challenging as that is.
Yeah. Michael, Peter, any last thoughts?
I was just, my last thoughts are, I believe more than anything that this kind of conversation is something we should be having in this format, around dinner tables, over coffee with friends, and have them be heart to heart, meaning it doesn't always have to be a knockdown drag out, but let me just tell you what hurts my heart about this situation, not what makes me angry, not what gets me fired up, not what makes me want to lash out, but what hurts my heart. Because if we can get more back to our heart center, we may make some of those choices, like you said, in the foxhole differently, and maybe peer up and see whether or not there's a way out.
Yeah, what I would add to that is most things are gray, right? And maybe one of the takeaways is the things that you think are black and white, to look for the gray in there, right? Most things, not all things, but if you could at least start to see gray instead of black or white, maybe that's progress.
Yeah. There's almost nothing that's absolute in this world.
Right.
And, it might be tilted far in one direction or the other. Hildegard says, communicating is an art, listening is, and I think we all can and should learn it. And critical thinking comes in here as well, which seems to be developed also by reading. And reading has become less popular, less common lately. So thank you, Hildegard, for taking part in the conversation. Thank you, all of you. I want to leave you with one story. When I was in seminary in Israel, we used to, and then it's still pretty much the same for those who are there. We get up very early in the morning to pray. Our prayers are recitation of pretty much the same words, day after day. We are being taught information, ideas. We stay up late. We're usually short on sleep. So from time to time, somebody will say, this is kind of like a cult, isn't it? You're sleep deprived, you're saying the same mantras again and again. Everybody is sort of working from the same body of information. Is this brainwashing? So the dean of my seminary said once, well, we don't wash brains here, we dry clean them. But the less flippant answer is that you can tell it's not a cult because we were encouraged to ask questions. And we were encouraged not to settle for simple answers. And in fact, when you go into the Talmudic study, if you go into a hall of study, you will see people arguing vociferously. Sometimes it looks like they're ready to come to blows with each other. It's not your public library. It looks like a combination of a soccer match, European soccer match, and cable news. But it is driven by a sincere desire to understand, to see both sides in hope that that will bring us closer to the truth. And if we can implement that in our lives, then I think we have a better chance of beginning to address these problems that seem intractable. So thank you very much, Michael Alsey, Michael Sherlock, Peter Winnick. Really, really appreciate your contribution to this conversation, and look forward to the next time we can be together individually or in the same constellation. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information there to submit your idea. If it's compelling, we will take it up on an episode. And until then, I encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.